which our panel here, of course, do not know. The first question tonight comes from Charlotte Dennis. Charlotte.
As someone about to enter the job market, do you think it's fair to increase government spending, like so many of you plan to do, when my generation will be left to pay off the debt?
Right, you have the question and you have a minute each to start with before we debate it. Nicola Sturgeon, would you start?
Well, I believe it's really important to get the deficit and the debt down. But I also believe that economic policy is not an end in itself. It's a means to allow people to live healthier, happier and more prosperous lives. And if that policy, the policy of austerity, is driving more people into poverty, including more children, if it's undermining our public services and if it's actually holding back economic growth, then I think it's time to change that policy. That's why the SNP is proposing an alternative, modest spending increases in the next Parliament that would still see the debt and the deficit reduced every year. Yes, it would take a couple of years longer to completely eliminate the deficit, but I think that is a price worth paying for enabling us to invest in infrastructure, in innovation, in skills, in the things that allow us to get our economy growing, to invest in our public services like the National Health Service and to have real action to lift people out of poverty. That's why I am proud to argue that alternative in this election.
Ed Miliband.
Charlotte, you're right. We've got to live within our means as a country. And that's why under my plan we'll cut the deficit every year and we'll balance the books. But we'll do it a different way from David Cameron. And I reject his plan to double the spending cuts next year, because I think for you and so many people in this audience who rely on our NHS, that would be a disaster. So here's our plan. Our plan is to have fair taxes, to reverse David Cameron's tax cut for millionaires, which has given every millionaire in Britain £43,000 a year. It's to clamp down on that tax avoidance and raise £7.5 billion a year. It's to protect education and health, but outside some key areas like that, to see spending fall. And it's also about something else. Because by raising living standards of working people in this country, we can get more tax revenues in and we can get the deficit down. It's a fair plan, it's a better plan from David Cameron's carrying on as he is.
Okay, Natalie, your turn.
Well, Charlotte, I'm greatly concerned about the debt that your generation faces. But that debt for about the 50% who go to university is tuition fee debt, which we want to reduce to zero and pay off the student loans. Students are leaving with £44,000 worth of debt on average. 73% of them will never pay it off. And of course, you're going out into a workplace where 1 in 5 workers is on less than a living wage. People aren't paid enough money to live on. They're indeed stacking up debts just to meet their basic costs. The cost of housing is enormous, and that's why we do want to deal with the debt and the deficit, and we reduce it to about 1% of GDP from 5% of GDP in our manifesto now. But if we invest some of that money in building a social home, a home that you might be able to live in and a genuinely affordable rent, if we invest that in renewable energy, in providing warm, comfortable, affordable to heat homes, then you are much better off. We've invested in your future, in your entire generation's future.
Nigel Farage.
Well, Charlotte, you're quite right. And what nobody wants to talk about, and it's a great shame that David Cameron is not here, is that in the last 5 years, our national debt has doubled from £850 billion to £1.5 trillion. The interest repayments on that are already bigger than our current level of defence spending, and that's with interest rates at rock bottom on the floor. So you're right, it is not fair because we are burdening future generations. All I can say is, listening to the promises that I've heard from the people here tonight and the other two who went somewhere else this evening, is they are going to drive us into even greater debt, frankly bankruptcy for your generation. UKIP is the only party to come up with a credible plan by cutting our foreign aid budget, by cutting our EU contributions, by stopping white elephant projects like HS2, and by recalculating the Barnett formula so that less money goes over Hadrian's Wall to Scotland. We can save £32 billion a year. And if you ally that to tax cuts and growth, UKIP is the only party with a plan to get this debt down.
Leanne Wood.
Plaid Cymru does want to tackle the deficit, but not at any cost and not according to artificial deadlines. We want to invest in the future generation and we want to invest in job creation. Our welfare state was hard fought for, and remember that investment was put in to building that welfare state in the 1940s when there was no money in the coffers, when the country's debt was massive. But that time delivered public services for all, and remember, it also delivered a generation in the 1950s that were told that they'd never had it so good. So continuing on the path of austerity will deliver a very uncertain future for the next generations. Investing in job creation and public services now will offer them a much better future.
Okay, thank you. Well, Ed Miliband, Nigel Farage says that he's the only one of the five of you who plans to get rid of a 1.5 trillion debt and £46 billion a year of interest payments. Is he right?
No, and look, his sums don't add up. But what I would say to Charlotte and the audience here and indeed at home is you've got to make a judgment about two things in this debate: balance and fairness. Look, I think there's some people on the stage who'll say there don't have to be any cuts at all. There'll be some people like Nigel who wants to follow David Cameron's extreme plan to double the cuts next year, which I think will be a disaster for our public services. And then this question of fairness. Look, Nigel actually wants to cut the top rate of income tax even further for the highest earners in our country, another £43,000 tax cut. Now, I just have a different view about the way a country succeeds. I think this idea that you just help the rich and powerful and the wealth will trickle down to everyone else is not the answer. You put working people first. So think about these two things as you cast your vote and make your decision: balance and fairness. I believe ours is a balanced plan and a fair plan.
Okay, and your sums, your sums don't add up.
Well, our sums do add up, and very interestingly, Ed, we're the first political party in the history of this country